You are listening to the Get Global podcast, a weekly journey into the international business landscape with leaders, knowers, and doers from around the world who share their stories and insights on the issues that matter most. Get Global brings you the best to help you thrive in foreign markets. Welcome to the Get Global podcast. This is Julian Luthold, and I am joined by Nisha Biswal, the president of the U.S.-India Business Council. Previously, before she joined the US IBC, she was with Albright Stonebridge Group, a consulting firm in Washington and a partner of Get Global. And before that, she had been the Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asian Affairs at the State Department from 2013 to 2017. Before that, Assistant Administrator at USAID, the International Development Branch of the government. And then before that, 10 years on Capitol Hill as Staff Director on the Senate Foreign Operations Appropriations Subcommittee and the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Representatives. Thank you for joining us, Nisha.
Julian, it's such a pleasure to be with you today.
Wonderful. So you spent some time here in Los Angeles this week for the Milken Global Conference. What were some of your impressions? What did you think?
Well, I just think that the Milken Global Conference is such an interesting place where you find all kinds of conversations that connect in different ways. I mean, you have, you're talking about very specific investment opportunities in emerging markets and more mature markets. But then you also have kind of social conversations about culture and religion and gender. For example, there was a whole focus on women, kind of reflecting on the Me Too movement. So Milken is just an exchange of ideas, a marketplace of ideas, and how they intersect with business and industry. So I loved being able to be part of a lot of different kinds of conversations. But of course, I was there to be part of a conversation around India and the opportunities that are presented by an emerging India and to what extent India is going to be a driver of global growth. So it was fun to connect my own knowledge and experience working on the U.S.-India corridor with a lot of the other conversations that were happening at Milken.
It seemed like there was a lot of energy around India and the discussion of India, which I think, typically on this coast, there's a lot of attention on China. What are your thoughts on this new or revitalized or augmented conversation around India right now?
Well, the conventional wisdom is that China is about a decade and a half ahead of India in terms of where its economy is and where the U.S.-China trade relationship is. But India, over the past 4.5 years, has also made some very significant strides. You have seen a significant uptick in investment going from the United States into India, and a lot more interest amongst segments of our industry that hadn't normally necessarily thought much about India. In fact, when I was at the State Department, the mantra I would hear more often than that is that most companies have had an India experience in the past, and it was not positive, and so therefore they were far more reluctant to re-engage on India than they were to enter into an emerging market where they had no experience. But I think that those perceptions are really starting to change. Part of that is, I think, that the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, has been very global in his outlook and has undertaken a campaign of sorts of rebranding India as an investment destination. His Make in India initiatives, his initiatives focusing on Invest India. He has pithy little sayings that he rolls out. We're going to replace the red tape with the red carpet. And he's been making the rounds and going to, capitals around the world, is, One of his very early visits during his tenure was to come to the United States to hit Wall Street and then, hit Pennsylvania Avenue, and start to position India in a different way. And last year he took, or I guess it was earlier this year, he took a massive business delegation to Davos. So this is the first time you've had an Indian prime minister that has been so singularly focused on the Indian brand, India Inc., as you might refer to it, and positioning that brand globally. And companies are starting to take notice. The Indian market is one that is becoming into much sharper focus for all segments of the private sector, whether you're looking at the energy market or the aviation market or the consumer goods market. India is a fast mover. And then I think the fact that the economy has been growing at a strong clip, and I think projections are about 7.3, 7.4% growth in the next quarter, and then ticking up to 7.6 after that. So the economy continues to be moving at a strong clip, and so you see more and more companies are interested in India. And our focus right now is how do you move from being interested in India to being invested in India? And that's kind of what the U.S.-India Business Council is really focused on, is expanding that two-way trade and investment.
And it seems, because I got into all of this through being an India watcher first, and noticing how these items that had been for so long on the foreign company checklist of reforms that they were hoping for, such as GST, bankruptcy law, the GST being the goods and services tax to make it easier to move products and services across borders and things like that. What do you make of the agenda so far with Modi? I know that he gets some flack for not going as far as some people thought he would, but when I look at what he's accomplished, it's quite serious. He's really done a lot to move the country forward along the lines that he said that he would. What's your take?
I mean, there's always going to be the glass half full, and we don't want to take our eyes off of the part of the glass that is not yet filled, because it represents what the potential really is in this relationship. But I think, as you noted, Julian, it's really important to remark on how much water has come into that glass. And GST is a big example. Narendra Modi didn't invent the idea of GST, but he did execute on it. And so to be able to move from rhetoric to actually making something into a reality is a very important accomplishment. And I think it's starting to really grease the skids on the Indian economy when you can, in reality, talk about a unified market. Rather than 34 separate markets that you have to negotiate and 34 separate tax, systems that you have to negotiate. Could GST be more streamlined? Yes, and I think people are focused on that. But the fact that you have moved towards a unified tax structure for the country, I think is hugely important. The bankruptcy law. I actually also think that demonetization at the end of the day is going to be a really important foundation for India. I know that the disruptive effect of the demonetization and the impact particularly on traders and on the poor, on those who were most dependent on a cash-based economy, is something that he gets criticized for, and perhaps rightly so. But at the end of the day, it's moving more of India out of an informal economy into a formal economy, more of India from a cash-based system to a system that is more focused on banking, on digital payment, and that, I think, and that has also, quite frankly, also generated more tax revenue for India. So if you're going to create the modern economy, you're going to have to do the disruption to bring it out of an informal and cash-based economy and into a more formalized and more institutionalized economy in terms of banking and in terms of payments architecture. And that's where I think Modi has made some significant strides. Now, in terms of the glass that is still half empty, as I sometimes point out to my counterparts in India, 7.5% growth is absolutely great and something that India should be proud of. It can't be satisfied with that. What India needs, if it's going to meet the needs of its citizenry, if it's going to generate the jobs, and if it's going to create the prosperity that 1.2 billion Indians want and aspire to, it's going to need to be growing, at 8.5%, 9%, 10% growth. And what does that mean? It means that all of the things that continue to impede economic growth, that continue to impede investment, those things are going to need to be dealt with, and not dealt with on a case-by-case basis, so that if you have, a Ford Motor Company or a Coca-Cola or a, Boeing wanting to put in, or an Amazon wanting to put in big investments, for sure the government of India finds ways to facilitate that, to address some of their concerns, and to clear some of the brush out of the way. But you can't be doing it on a case-by-case basis. What you need to do is actually create much more systemic frameworks for investment, so that your tax systems and that your regulatory systems and your oversight mechanisms, your licensing and inspection and permitting processes, that all of these are streamlined, that they're transparent, that they are, the points of leakage in the system, that these are all addressed. And so that level of systemic change is still to be done. I think it started moving in some areas, and that's why you've seen India move up in the ease of doing business rankings. But it's still at, the rank is still at 100. And a top 5 economy, which India soon will be, should not be ranked at 100 in the ease of doing business rankings, So how do you get India out of the 100th position and to the 50th, or frankly, ultimately, within the top 25 economies in terms of ease of doing business, in terms of starting a business, in terms of, ease of imports, ease of exports, etc. And that's where there is a lot of work to be done.
So looking at some of the progress that's been made, and then the comments you just made about the glass being half empty, from where you sit, what would you say are your top priorities, the things that, if you could wave your hand, would be the things that you would change and ask the government to do, or reform, make progress on?
Well, the way that I look at it is that it's not necessarily about one or two key reforms, but about a framework. I mean, having spent 4 years in government working on the U.S.-India relationship, and having tried to bring forward a bilateral investment treaty, which we just were not able to get off the ground during my tenure in the Obama administration. And the fact that we don't have a trade architecture between the United States and India. We don't have a free trade agreement. We don't have an agreement in services. We don't have an investment treaty. This means that on every issue, we have to negotiate separately. On every issue, we have to try to get redress for our companies on a case-by-case basis. So to me, the thing that could be a real game changer on U.S.-India trade is if the US and India could put themselves on a path towards a bilateral trade agreement and the building blocks that would get us there. And certainly a bilateral investment treaty would be an important building block. Maybe looking at doing some kind of a framework agreement on services that would address some of the big issues that the Indian side always raises with us, whether it's on workforce mobility, whether it's on, access to the U.S. market. And then, what are the big issues that can clear the path for U.S. investment into India? That, whether it be on services or whether it be on various categories of goods. How do we get multi-brand retail? How do we get insurance liberalization? How do we get liberalization in legal services and things like that? So I think, if we could really think about and move towards a day when the U.S. and India could have a bilateral agreement, I think that would be a real game changer. In the meantime, we continue to work at these issues, whether it's through USIBC and the efforts that we make with the government, certainly the U.S. government through the Trade Policy Forum, through the commercial dialogue, et cetera, continue to work through all of these issues as well.
So a trade agreement, I think, would be, that's always been mentioned, since I started looking into India as the crown jewel or the final result, the thing that everyone seems to look forward to the day then that can potentially come up on the agenda. Interesting. I hope we can get there soon. Now you've been stressing. Oh, please.
No, I was going to say soon is probably not in the cards, but the time may be right for us to at least build an honest conversation on trade between our two countries. And I think the fact, you mentioned earlier on how our gaze has always been very much as industry focused on China and the kind of lower hanging fruit and easier path that China has represented. But of late, I think there's been a bit tougher road on U.S.-China trade. And so more and more companies, as they see some headwinds with all of the tough trade issues that are emerging on U.S.-China front, are starting to look at India, look at the market, which is quite sizable and attractive, look at the economic growth and what that represents, and starting to say, well, maybe the time has come for the U.S. and India to focus in earnest on how we enhance economic cooperation, economic partnership between our two countries.
So discussing that a little bit more, and especially since you mentioned that when you look at the growth curve of China and compare it to India's, it's really the same growth curve separated by 12-ish years or so. Do you think it's the right time to invest in India if say you are a medium or large company that maybe got burned and has been considering about going back in or going in for the first time?
Absolutely. I think the potential for U.S. companies to do well and do good in India is enormous. And I put it like that, do well and do good, because I do think that American technology, American expertise, American best practices as embodied by our private sector, whether it's in digital economy and technology, whether it's in consumer goods, whether it's in clean water or clean energy or defense technology or infrastructure or energy. I think we are fundamental to the transformation of India. At the same time, because of the size of the Indian market, because some, 75% of India's infrastructure of 2030 has yet to be built, and the massive infrastructure boom that India has ahead of it. Because of the fact that it's the fastest growing aviation market in the world, because Indian tourists, along with Chinese tourists, are the fastest growing source of tourism around the world, and certainly one of the fastest growing into the United States. And because of so many other elements, education and the number of Indian students who are now seeking higher education, both within India and outside of India. So almost every sector you can think of, India represents a, top 5 market. And that makes it an opportunity for U.S. companies to do really well as do good.
And it's been our point of view here at Get Global that India we think, undervalued for that. That folks really should be paying attention to what's going on there, because there could be a point that comes sooner than people might think where it's a little too late to be the leader or the first ones to build the relationships that last a long time.
Yeah, the way I try to frame it sometimes is that, we have a lot of companies that are dipping their toe in, but are, finding that the water is not quite the right temperature for them to dive in. And I said, if you keep dipping your toe in and waiting for the water to warm up, you'll find that the pool is so crowded that there's no space left for you to dive in. So I said, go dive in and warm the water up from the inside, change and shape the ecosystem from within rather than waiting on the outside for others to shape it.
I think Amazon learned that lesson the hard way in China, that by the time they wanted to get serious about it, it had already evolved and consumer loyalties were already fairly well built out. And I think that's probably what's driving so much of their serious behavior toward India. They are just going with so much force in that country.
Absolutely. And I think Amazon has been very bold and very ambitious, and I think it has positioned itself well as a result of that.
So this week you've been mentioning in your engagements and in conversation that it's really important to get outside the capitals in India and the US, and that's driving a lot of your behavior at the council. What's inspiring that?
If you think about where most of your market is, it's not in the capital. If you think about where most of your manufacturing is, your production lines, it's not in the capital. If you think about where most of the procurement decisions, India, like the United States, is decentralized and federated, system. And that means that the B2B opportunities are not determined as much in the DC to Delhi traffic as it is on, connecting at the broader level of state and urban connectivity. So you have the San Francisco to Bangalore, Silicon Valley to India's, Bangalore tech corridor. You have the Hollywood to Bollywood. You have, the financial connectivities between New York and Mumbai, and energy. Coming out of Texas, and so you have to really think about how you take this U.S.-India relationship and socialize it and animate it in the various centers of business and commerce across both countries. And for too long, I think the government to government and the capital to capital. When you're doing capital to capital, you're talking about the government relations people in companies that you're engaging. And those are important because they're the ones who are really focused on the policy environment. So I absolutely work very closely with all of the government relations folks in Washington and in New Delhi on shaping the policy agenda, on advancing key policy priorities. But where you really engage and excite people around the investment opportunities is when you go, to Hyderabad and you see the amount of U.S. investment that's there, and you see the dynamic leadership that chief minister and the minister for IT in Hyderabad, in Telangana, have on their ambitious vision for growth, and how do you connect American companies to that opportunity. How do you go to Los Angeles and look at the very dynamic and global economy that we have in Southern California, and say, okay, what are the opportunities for this, for this very robust economy to now connect more deeply with India? What is it on? Is it on clean technology? Is it on media and entertainment? How do we deepen the Hollywood to Bollywood corridor? Is it on aerospace and defense? On health and life sciences? Biotechnology? How do we make sure that businesses, that are based out of the Southern California region are finding their markets, are finding their partners and their collaborations in India, and vice versa. And so part of what we're doing at USIBC and at the U.S. Chamber, which is our parent organization, is connecting with kind of the Federation of State and Local Chambers of Commerce, and bringing them into more deep engagement on India. And similarly, we are engaging Indian states and cities, particularly with a robust plan to grow 100 new smart cities in the coming years, to say, okay, as that boom happens in urban infrastructure, how can we bring some of the best in class technology and capability from the United States into India's growth projections?
So building on that, and also thinking about something that I think is keeping people up at night, both in Washington and in San Francisco, is the issue of privacy. And we've been in the middle of seeing what happened with Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica issue. Certainly after Mark Zuckerberg's testimony in front of Congress, this is going to be an ongoing issue here. But I'm also keeping an eye on what this means in foreign markets, and in particular India, where the concept of privacy is being hashed out in regulation and even in sort of the way that it thinks about it culturally. There was an interesting moment that I had a couple of years ago as the Edward Snowden issue was exploding around the world, and Brazil was up in arms, and Germany was having very strong feelings about it as well. But in India, there really hadn't been very much in terms of reaction. And I asked Santosh Desai, the managing director of Future Brands and a longtime commentator, thought leader in India on society and advertising. I asked him, I said, why is that the case? And he said, Julian, I don't know if you've ever been, spent a lot of time in an Indian household, but this whole idea of privacy, you won't find it there. There is no privacy in India. And to a point, he said that I think that in a way, privacy might even be a Western concept. So this is something that seems to be, in certain ways, a clean slate, Obviously, with the free basics issue and several other moments in the privacy discussion, there's been a feeling about protecting against a new kind of colonialism or something along those lines. What do you think is going on in the contours around this issue? I suspect that it's something that you're hearing a lot about and will probably play a role in.
Yeah, so I think the privacy issue is actually starting to resonate in a big way in India, not necessarily from the consumer class of citizens being completely galvanized around data privacy, but certainly from the perspective of the larger kind of societal interest and government interest on data privacy, cybersecurity, and how to manage that data responsibly and yet not stifle innovation and stifle economic growth. So India, I think, is in some ways positioned quite differently from any other country. I don't know if you've heard about India Stack, which is a pretty ambitious kind of vision, and more than a vision, it's at this point fast moving into reality. That is essentially kind of the digital architecture that is being put in place in India with the Aadhaar or biometric universal ID platform that the government has put in place, layered with then digital payment, universal digital payment architecture, layered with a provision of government services via this universal ID and payment architecture, so that you can provide direct benefits to the citizens, through this digital platform that you've put in place. So what all of that means is that the government is putting a digital architecture in place that is going to be extremely data rich in terms of bringing in, the data of 1.2 billion Indians. And how do you then, on the one hand, protect the security and the privacy of that information, and on the other hand, create a platform on which an entire economy can be built? Because this is, as Nandan Nilekani likes to say, in India, we may be economically poor, but we are data rich. We own our own data. And so how do you help Indians recognize the economic value and benefit of that data? And so this is going to be a critical issue for the Indians to navigate. What I think, what we want to do through USIBC, looking at, our membership, which are both U.S. and Indian companies, is help be in conversation with government on how do you help create the new norms that guide data privacy and cybersecurity, and that still enable innovation and economic growth. Is it the more authoritarian model of China? Is it the more regulatory heavy model of Europe? Or is there a path that India can blaze that is different from either of those? And that, I think, is what is going to be a very, very interesting set of initiatives and or an evolution of thinking of regulatory body that's going to unfold in India in the coming months and coming years. And I think that the U.S. is going to be wanting to partner on that.
So what is your feeling on what you would want to tell companies that came to you for advice about how to, manage this transition over the coming months and years as India works all of this out? How can they, move confidently, but at the same time cautiously?
I mean, I think fundamentally, and I tell this to all of our companies, you have to understand what is the policy priority and objective that government is seeking to uh, achieve. You know, and if the government of India says, well, we are demanding data localization because we feel like we need to be able to, one, safeguard the data of our citizens, and two, be able to have access to data for security and law enforcement purposes. What happens when there's a terrorist attack and the data around that attack sits on a server of a company, you know, in San Jose, California? What access do we have to that information, and how do we deal with it? And so I think that if you understand what are the kind of key and credible goals that government has, and then what are the key goals and needs that industry has, and try to bring that into one conversation and say, okay, how do we both meet our own needs for growth and for securing the data of our consumers, of our customers, and how do we help government be able to address its needs? Then I think you can usually find a middle path. But if you fundamentally fail to understand what is driving and motivating government, then it's very hard to find the middle ground. And similarly for government, if you don't have an understanding of what industry needs to be viable and you regulate in a vacuum, you will have the unintended consequence of stifling industry, stifling growth, and driving out investment. And so neither side wants to see an outcome that is going to be untenable for the other side. And so how do we bring that discussion, create the table where both perspectives can come to that table and we can figure out the way forward?
And something I've noticed about this government in India is that they're abnormally willing to listen and talk to industry. Whenever I've talked to officials out in India, since the beginning of the Modi administration, but particularly in the last year and a half, they're always having some sort of a discussion with an industry group, or having industry parties that are stakeholders in something that they're building, coming through and talking to them about it. It's I think that's a nice thing to see. I think previously I didn't really notice that. Did you?
No, I think that there is a greater understanding that that industry and government need to be able to collaborate and work together. Now, I think this government has been in somewhat of a stronger footing. It has taken a very strong anti-corruption stance. And part of what I think often prevented industry collaboration with government was a fear of being charged with corruption, and trying to understand how you can, in a transparent and in a well-regulated space, bring industry and government to the table. In the United States, you often get criticized for the revolving door between government and industry. But the benefit of the revolving door is that you're constantly refreshing the software, updating the software of government. You have far more understanding in government about what it takes for businesses to be successful. And similarly, you have far more understanding in industry on what the policy perspectives and needs are of government. And that kind of back and forth doesn't exist in India. And so you often have senior government leaders and regulators who have never spent any time in industry and don't necessarily know what it takes for a business to be able to thrive.
Yeah. Well, switching tracks for our last question, or our last set of questions that I'm curious about is a topic that I know that is interesting and important to you, and it's also one of my fascinations since I took some study in India on the topic, is progress and change among India's women. There has been so much that seems to have changed, particularly through catalyzing events like the Nirbhaya incident years ago, and then recently with the Asifa Bano case, but also the conversations that has started about how deep in the culture these feelings toward women are, what women today want for themselves, what they are doing within the economy, and how the rest of Indian society, from fathers and mothers all the way down to employers and sisters and brothers, what they can be doing to advance the cause of women and equality. There have been some really amazing numbers that have come out recently. I think McKinsey just estimated that $770 billion of economic activity will be missing from the Indian economy by 2025 if women are not are not included in the economy the way that they ought to be. What do you make of these changes, and what do you think the future is for women in India?
I mean, I think that you're going to see in the coming decade a massive shift and change on attitudes towards women in the economy. It's inevitable, but it's not going to be a straight, easy, direct path. I think what you will see is as more and more women enter the workforce, and also more and more women enter the middle class. And so their purchasing power in the economy increases, and so their voice in the economy increases, that attitudes will start to shift. But what you're seeing right now is kind of the backlash of, as you see women modernizing and seeking to take their place in the workforce, that there are still many outdated attitudes that they confront. And so you are seeing, I think, both because there's more reporting and more attention being shined on it, but because also I think that there is more incidents occurring of gender-based violence in India. And that, I think, is reflective to me that as you take societal norms and start to shift them and change them as they start to evolve, it doesn't happen in a straight, clean, easy path with everyone's attitudes changing all at once. You have those who are going to be the leading edge of that change, and then you have those who are going to lash out against that change. And that clash is what I think is so heartbreakingly evident in some of these violent incidences that we're hearing so much about. I'm heartened by the fact that they are gaining so much attention and focus and light, that it's not being swept under the rug, but that it is being talked about and shamed, and that steps are being taken to then bring the perpetrators to justice. I think the fact that there has been more attention being paid on access to justice for women who have been victims of crime, of violence, of discrimination is a good thing. But India still has far to go. Now, I firmly think that this is a almost inevitable course of action, that women in India are going to continue to really drive that change forward. both to gain their rightful place in the economy and in society and politics. And I think men, by and large, will be there and be at their side on that. But societal norms, it's generational change, right? So it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen as successive new generations come and go through the educational system and go through the workforce, so that new and incoming classes. I think it was Mohit Jain at Infosys who made the comment that the new entrants into the labor force at Infosys are over 50% women.
Yeah, that struck me as well. That is certainly going to have an effect on middle and senior levels soon enough. Now, in your recent talks in Los Angeles, you mentioned "Main kuch bhi kar sakti hoon," which is I, a woman, can achieve anything, which is a tremendously popular Indian edutainment series focusing on women's issues in India. Briefly, while we still have a moment, why do you think it's caught on to the degree that it has, in the way that it has? It's up to nearly 400 million people watching, and it's going into its third season soon. Last we checked.
I mean, I think it connects fundamentally with the viewers, right? It's an incredibly well done show, but it talks about, the storylines are very relevant to the experiences of women in India, and it has really struck a real chord with them. It doesn't lecture, it doesn't proselytize, but it really just explores, the challenges and kind of exemplifies an ability to overcome those challenges. And I think so. It's really struck a real popular chord in India, and is really, in that sense, been a phenom of sorts.
I'm just amazed by that number, 400 million people, larger than the entire population of the United States watching one show. Unreal. Well, Nisha, thank you so much for joining us. It's a real honor and pleasure, and I'm hoping we can do this again very soon.
I would look forward to that, Julian. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed today's conversation.
Thanks again. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to find out more about our events and get more global intel every week, sign up for our newsletter at getglobal.co.